In biology, we talk about groups of living things. And just as a teacher of biology, I hope that there are real biological groups. Otherwise, students would just hate my classes. Just students go through so much trouble, as I did, to learn the anatomy, the structures, the physiology, the enzymes, the genes, et cetera, of individual organisms. But given that there are well over 1 million organisms that we've identified, and probably more that we haven't, just where does one start? Where would one end? What would be the purpose of studying all of the anatomical structures of this plant, this invertebrate, this vertebrate, this fungus, the genes found in each, etc. If there weren't groups, if then one had to start all over again with a new organism and then start all over again. I hope that there are groups where instead of spending, years of one's life studying this organism then that one could say, I've learned something about vertebrates. After studying one or a couple of vertebrates, I now know facts that can apply to all of them. We're studying the genes of one mammal. We're studying the cellular structure of one eukaryote, et cetera. If we could learn things which then apply more generally, that would make biology understandable as opposed to just this mass of senseless facts to memorize. So as a biologist, when I look at these organisms, I want to put them into groups. Let's say I do that. Let's say that I note that a couple of them are yellow, and I decide I'll make a yellow group. And a couple of them, trying not to be judgmental, but nevertheless, I find some of them ugly. And so I put some into an ugly group. And I notice some don't have legs, so I put a legless group or a blue group, etc. So I'm a biologist. I've classified living things into groups. The problem is that these groups are horrible, all right, that among other things, they aren't biological groups, because a biological group would now allow me to make predictions which turn out to be true. But what could I say that, based on these things both being yellow, I could predict that they would share more traits in common, but it turns out that they don't. They don't. Yellow organisms don't share traits among themselves that aren't shared by non-yellow organisms. What do these, quote, ugly, and my apologies, I think both of them are wonderful. What do they share? What do the legless ones share, this being an amphibian and this being a reptile? So it turns out, one can come up with groups, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those are good groups or real biological groups. We want real biological groups. And the beauty is, so for example, when I teach comparative vertebrate anatomy, the beauty is let's say you take a mammal and you learn the structures of its brain. Well, then you're amazed in that when you look at the brains of other mammals, you know what you're looking at. You just had to study one, and you can apply that to other members of that group. Or if you study muscles or bones of one vertebrate, very often now you can start naming the bones and muscles in other vertebrates that you haven't studied. Knowing that something belongs to the group of vertebrates allows you to make predictions about the brain structures, the muscles, the bones, etc., which turn out to be true. Turns out vertebrate is a really good group. Mammal is a really good group. These are biological groups. And so then this video is going to overview all of the shorter videos I have, going through the idea of cladistics, the idea of classifying biological groups, how one does that, how one tests that. Because once again, I just demonstrated, you can make lousy groups, you can make groups which aren't real. And so how does one then test groups to determine which groups have more support than others? One big conclusion that will come from this is that in biology, the major taxonomic grouping is what we could call a nested hierarchy. Notice that these are classified as birds, but they're also classified as amniotes. Now, some amniotes are birds, but then many aren't, such as this snake. The amniotes are all classified as vertebrates. Now, there are vertebrates like this frog and the Sicilian, which are not amniotes, but they are vertebrates. Then there are animals which are not vertebrates, like this tarantula. And there are eukaryotes, which are not animals. But these birds belong to each group. The birds are not only birds, but also amniotes, vertebrates, animals, and eukaryotes. The amphibians are vertebrates, animals, and eukaryotes. And so what we observe in biology is a nested hierarchy of groups within groups, and that these are real biological groups. Because just because I've said that this is an amniote, then if you study biology, you should say, oh, I know something about its respiratory system now. I know something about how its respiratory muscles, that it's using external, it's using intercostals to breathe, as opposed to these amphibians. I know something about its brain. I know something about its genes, etc. So one can make predictions which turn out to be true just because you know what groups these belong to. So once again, because the nested hierarchy is kind of a big conclusion of this, let me just once again be clear on what that is. So all people on Earth are related. Once upon a time, my great-great-great-grand-somethings were your great-great-great-great-grand-somethings. We are kin, you and I. You are related to everybody on planet Earth. That being said, you are not related to everybody equally. So for example, let's say we make a depiction of you and your relationships with all other people on the planet. You are in the middle. Now, you would be most closely related to your siblings. So you and your siblings would form a group. You are more closely related to each other than you are to other members here. But then you, your siblings, and your first cousins would form a group. You, your siblings, your first cousins, your second cousins would form a group, etc. And so forth. You would see this set of groups. You are related to everyone, but you aren't related to everyone equally. And so there's a set of groups within groups. Now, we apply this same feature to living things, because as we progress further, the anatomical, the genetic, etc., the evidence supports that all living things are related and therefore form a group. Just knowing something is alive, you can make predictions about the lipids found in the cell membrane, how DNA is replicated, just knowing that something is a living thing. Within the living things, there is a subgroup called the eukaryotes. Within the subgroup of eukaryotes, there's a subgroup called animals, etc. So animals are eukaryotes and they are alive. Metazoan animals are animals, and then they are eukaryotes and they are alive, etc. And so we could go through these groups within groups. This is what is called a nested hierarchy. And this is the grand taxonomic scheme of classification, which the anatomical, genetic, etc. evidence has supported. Now, once again, in biology, we test everything. I'll be talking about that. And so, some groups are questioned, etc. So bilaterians, their classification is different from what it was when I made this video, as is coelomates. And there's, sometimes discrepancy, for example, in those two examples, where you could say, using anatomical traits, this group seems to be a valid biological group. While using genetic traits, we come to a different, a slightly different conclusion. So we'll be getting to that. So, groups can change, and you could say there's more support for this grouping than for that grouping. We should change how we look at things. And that's good. That's what science is all about. But once again, as we look at our place in the biological world, we see that we and all other living things belong to biological species, which are then parts of genera, which are then parts of subfamilies and families and orders and classes, and a nested hierarchy of groups. Now, just a couple of terms we use in cladistics. First, the type of group we're looking for is what's called a monophyletic group or a clade. All right. So in a monophyletic group or a clade, so for example, here we hold that once there were vertebrates. From the very first vertebrates, which were jawless, evolved the jawed vertebrates. And we hold that the jawed vertebrates therefore form a clade, the gnathostomes, jawed vertebrates, that all of these are related, that the group gnathostomes contains all of the members, all of the descendants of this first set of ancestral gnathostomes, and that they would share traits like jaws, an enlarged cerebellum, we could, a stomach, we could go on and on, which these first gnathostomes had. And so gnathostomes we consider to be a real biological group because there are traits which we could call derived traits that these ancestral vertebrates didn't have. They had them primitive traits such as not having jaws. So having jaws would be a derived trait, or what we could then also then call a synapomorphy. And so these, because gnathostomes would then include all of the descendants of the first gnathostomes, and that they would share then biological features, then we would consider this to be a good example of a biological group, a clade, or a monophyletic group. So once again, jaws then did not exist in the ancestors. The anatomical and genetic evidence indicates that the cartilage in the pharyngeal bars, which exist in the jawless vertebrates, the first two were modified to form jaws. So this was a new condition, a derived feature that now defines the jawed vertebrates, also known as a synapomorph. The ancestral state, the plesiomorphic condition, was to have a mouth without jaws, but that was then changed. There was a new derived feature of having jaws. And so if you want to see whether something is a real biological group, you look for these derived features, these synapomorphies, which define a group. If you can say, here's a group, and they all share this trait, all right, that it is different from the ancestral state, then that's support that your group is a real biological group. Now, there are lots of traits that you could measure, some of which aren't going to be helpful in defining whether this is a real group or not. So you could say, they have bone, and then you could say, well, the ancestral jawless fish had bone. Gnathostomes have bone unless they have secondarily lost it, like sharks. And so therefore, bone tissue is what's called a symplesiomorphy. So it's shared between the ancestral group and the derived clade. So it's not useful in defining whether this is a good biological group or not. And so we would focus on derived synapomorphies, such as jaws, and enlarged cerebellum, the stomach, etc. So here's, defining those terms very often is not very exciting. But here's an example where, one could ask whether it's exciting. It wasn't that long ago that the origin of birds was considered this great mystery. We're not quite sure where birds came from. And although dinosaurs were possible as ancestors of birds, there wasn't strong support for that. But because of greater study and a wealth of new fossil material, it is now considered that birds and theropod dinosaurs form a clade, a monophyletic group. This is exciting. This means that dinosaurs did not really become extinct. Only most of them became extinct. That one lineage of derived dinosaurs that developed feathers and the ability to fly, that they're still alive today. So that's kind of a neat, change in how we view the world. Now, how could you support that? That birds and dinosaurs are actually a clade shared with of a monophyletic group? Well, the answer is, well, you look for traits. So what defines a theropod dinosaur? What defines one of the subgroups known as the tetanorans? What defines the avetheropod? So as you'll see, there's all of these different groupings within the meat-eating dinosaurs. And if you're going to classify a dinosaur, well, you need rules. So it's a theropod if it has these traits. But interestingly, birds, at least the first birds, have those traits. And then as we go into the subsequent groups of theropods, along here you'll see all of the traits which are used to define that that group of theropods. So if you find dinosaur bones, you just can't say, call it a theropod, call it this, call it that. If you want to call it a neotheropod, that's a subgroup of the theropods, you do so because it has these features. But birds, at least the first birds, also have those features, and so forth. And so we then have this great amount of support for the idea that birds are modified dinosaurs, because birds have the derived features that the theropods share and that define the theropods. And the same could be said for the group neotheropods, a subgroup of theropods. And the same could be said for the tetanorans and the avetheropods and the maniraptorans and the paraves, etc. So there's all of these subgroups, and we have rules to be a part of this group. What traits do you have? What are the derived features, the synapomorphies, that define this group? Well, birds, at least the first birds, have all of these traits. As such, this is then cladistic evidence that birds belong in the same group as theropod dinosaurs, that birds are modified dinosaurs. So once again, the first set of definitions, a little less exciting, but the fact that we can actually say, all right, well, based on cladistic analysis, we're going to break the dinosaurs into groups, and birds fit in that group. All right. Now, as you're looking at traits, you could say, well, let's put, make this group together a group which has shells. All right, so look, turtles have shells with dermal bones. So do the extinct placodons. Heck, so do armadillos. Maybe they represent a monophyletic group. Now, if it's a real monophyletic group, a clade, that would mean that the presence of a shell is a derived feature that they share, a synapomorphy, which would mean that it would be in the ancestors of this group that a shell first evolved, and that the descendants which have a shell would all then have inherited from this common ancestor, which had a shell. But as we start to then study the anatomy of other animals, we realize that's not the case, because turtles